morning. It's Wednesday. You know what that means. Time for the Southern California Writers Association Hump Day Book Tour. I'm your host, Maddie Margarita, here with Diana Pardee on tech. Every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., the Southern California Writers Association turns our page over to a new author, although James. London, James T. Bartlett has been published in over 130 magazines and newspapers, including the LA Times, LA Weekly, Los Angeles Magazine, American Way. Here we go. I'm going to see how quickly I can get through this. High Life, Hemispheres, The Guardian, Delta Sky, the Daily Telegraph, Variety, Real Crime, Ripperologist. See, I practiced that. History, Ireland, and Bizarre. He also runs a true crime book club, writes for BBC.com and at atlasobscura.com, posts historic LA crimes at www.gourmetghost.com and on Facebook and Twitter. And we're here to talk about his latest, The Alaskan Blonde, Sex Secrets and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America. Welcome, James.
Hello, Maddie. Hello, everybody. Thank you for everyone who's coming and listening to me talk today.
Well, I think I had that extra cup of coffee, so that intro went really fast.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, welcome back. And,
thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we talked a little bit about some of the things that you've done before, but now we have seen Alaskan Blonde get Concrete yes. Blonde, one of my favorite bands. But anyway,
we talked about it last time. You're right. We mentioned it, and I said it was nearly finished, and you were very kind. Right. You said when it's out, you must come back. So yes. There it is. It exists. It's in a physical
that's
form.
Her.
That's her. Yes, that's Diane Wells, the Alaskan Blonde. So wow. That's a picture, obviously, with the paparazzi of the day at Seattle Airport, where they took a picture of her. That was when she was arrested straight after getting off the plane for the murder of her husband. And she went straight to court. They did all the charges against her and then was sent straight back to Fairbanks the next day.
Well, I don't know if she practiced that expression or if that was a genuine expression. But yeah, that was perfection. Right there.
Yes. I mean, there's a couple of others. I mean, I made some buttons up originally. That was another one that they got that was in a lot of the newspapers. And they were all, as you could tell, mainly from here at the airports where the press waited for her, where she was wearing the fur coat. And she was pretty bewildered and upset. Those were genuine pictures of confusion.
Yeah. Well, okay. So for anybody who might not have joined us last time, talk a little bit about this crime. And well, would you characterize this as true crime? The book is true crime?
It's true crime, yeah. It was a crime that happened in the 1950s, in 1953, yeah.
Okay. So what was it about this particular, I know since murder is sort of an interest, well, not murder, but crime in general is an interest of yours in a positive, fully wholesome way.
Yes.
So what was it about this particular incident that attracted you?
Well, I found out about the murder initially when I was working on another book. And I just thought to myself, that sounds like such an interesting story. I must find out more about it. There must be a book written about it because of the circumstances and so forth. But there wasn't a book. And I looked up, the newspaper archives, thank goodness for the public library archives and online archives. And there was detective magazines. It was a big story. It was very scandalous, and it made the newspapers in the US and in Canada and Australia and the UK, which is very unusual because in 1953, Alaska was a territory. It wasn't even a state. So they didn't really cover much news from Alaska at all. Really, they don't cover a great deal today. And it just intrigued me specifically because I thought it was a crime and the circumstances of it, that if it happened today, I thought it would play out in exactly the same way. I didn't really think that nearly 70 years would have made particularly any difference as to how the media reaction would have been and the public reaction and what people would have thought and what might have happened in the end. And so that really just led me down a sort of a 5-year rabbit hole, really, of just finding everything I could find out about the story, initially trying to contact any living family members. There were several children, obviously, at the time who were now, grandparents themselves, to find out what happened, really, I guess, out of curiosity initially. But then once I talked to family members, maybe considering I might write an article perhaps, because it had a connection to to Hollywood and Los Angeles, and I write for a lot of the papers here, I found out that nearly all the family members really had no idea what happened themselves in relation to the murder, because the murder never came to trial. And no one went to prison for the murder. So the family members really had no idea what happened or who was guilty. There were lots of theories, but nothing really concrete. So they kind of asked me, would I find out what happened? Let them know what I found out. And that led to sort of a 5-year research trip, really. I went up to Fairbanks, which is where the murder happened in October 1953. And all the buildings that are involved were still there. The building where the murder happened was called the Northwood Building. It's still there. It was a skyscraper, as it was called in those days. It was only 8 stories high. But that was the newest building in downtown Fairbanks, very fashionable. That building was still there, and I managed to sneak into it. The courthouse was still here, the city hall, and so forth. And it just really intrigued me. And then I started to realize it was more about trying to find out for what the family members wanted to know, because I was talking to family members who were saying, I don't know anything about my grandparents. All I know is that, my grandfather was murdered by my grandmother. Is that true? And so that was what I tried to find out through the book, and tried to take it through sort of in a chronological order, and then looking towards the end at the theories that were put forward, because there was an FBI file. Obviously, there was a police file. There were these newspaper articles at the time. And then there were, of course, what people told me about the case, or what they thought they knew and what had happened. And I managed to get hold of some photographs. And there was a memoir from one of the law enforcement officers who was involved. He spoke about the case, and that was unpublished. That had a couple of useful things in it. And really, that was just what led to the book, and the Alaskan Blonde obviously was what she was called in the newspapers. She was an extremely attractive young blonde woman. I know that's not especially fashionable to, describe someone that way today, but everyone I talked to, male and female, was saying she was absolutely stunning. She was, like an actress. She was the most beautiful woman in town. And so when her husband, who was 20 years older than her, when she called the police one morning saying that 2 men had broken into their apartment, beaten her up, and shot her husband Cecil while he was asleep, that was kind of a classic true crime story that we'll see on TV today. And that sort of really just made me wonder what had happened. And I wanted to try and find out and what happened to the people who were involved. That's a long answer, I know.
No, that was a great answer. Diana here. Maddie's having technical difficulties again. So it's kind of like you became a cold case investigator as you did this. And I'm kind of curious, maybe you mentioned this before, but why hadn't the police ever pursued this more actively?
Well, that's a good question. They did a good job, and we have to remember again, as it keeps coming, this was 1953 in territorial Alaska. So for those of those who don't know much about Alaska, which includes me, it's an enormously vast area. It's hard to really understand how big and how largely unpopulated it is. The biggest town is Anchorage, and that has 250,000 people. And then there's a drop off immediately to, Fairbanks, which has 30,000 people. So that's Fairbanks is still the second biggest city in Alaska, and it has 30,000 people. So back then there was 5,000 to 10,000 people living there. And so the police were completely underfunded and overstretched. And, the state troopers were often called in. And because it was a territory, anything that was a federal crime like murder, the FBI would be called in. But a lot of the time, they had to get to these places, in sort of interior Alaska or far Alaska. Often it was expensive and it took a lot of time. But in this case, Cecil Wells was very important. He was a very rich, very influential, successful businessman. He was known across Alaska. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce. He was in the papers regularly. He was a big cheese, as they would say. And like I say, it would be the same today. It would be like the head of a very rich company being murdered by, well, not by, but being accused of being murdered by his younger wife. So the police did investigate. It was a big deal. The chief of police was new in the job. That probably had something to do with it. His name was E.V. Danforth. The DA was new in the job as well. His name was Ted Stevens, who actually became a legendary politician for Alaska generally throughout the rest of his career. But that was his first case. And it was a tough one. It was a really difficult one because this was a very prominent member of society. There had been other crimes in Fairbanks, home invasions, where people had been shot, and it had been other important members of society. Much like today, you know, the importance is when it's someone rich and influential. And of course, being 1953, Alaska was trying to become a state, and law and order and crime was something that obviously was being looked at, and rich people getting murdered in their beds was not a good look. But the thing that really changed the investigation after they did the initial, you know, they did the inquest and the coronial inquest, and, you know, Cecil had been shot in the head from relatively close range with a 380. Diane had been beaten up. She was bad. She was beaten and bruised. She had 2 black eyes. She went to hospital. But her description of 2 men breaking in just didn't seem to add up. The jewelry and the money that she said was missing was found. And then the police got a tip-off that she had possibly been having an affair with a guy called Johnny Warren. Now, Johnny Warren was a black musician. He was also married. And that, as you can imagine, in 1950s America, that became bigger almost than the murder. That was more scandalous. That's what gave it the impetus to make all the papers in the lower 48, as Alaskans often call the US, the contiguous US. And so eventually the arrest warrants were sent out for Diane and for Johnny. They were both indicted for first-degree murder themselves. And both arrested, and then they were brought back to Fairbanks because Diane had gone down to LA, or rather she was arrested in Seattle at the airport, like in the picture. And Johnny had left town the night of the murder. That was when police really started to fixate on him, as you might. He had been seen around town the night of the murder. He'd been outside the Northwood building where the murder happened on the night of the murder. But in Fairbanks, that wasn't such a big deal. That building is the center of town. There was a bar there. A lot of bars were nearby. It wasn't unusual to be at that building, but he'd left town that night, and that looked very suspicious. So he'd voluntarily initially went to the police when they tracked down where he was, which was in Oakland, in California. And he told the police that they had been having an affair, that they'd been intimate, was the term that was used at the time. And it wasn't until you look in the FBI files that you actually find the letters that Diane sent to him. There's 3 or 4 letters at least, or at least 3 or 4 letters in the file that were, you know, they were not salacious or pornographic, but they clearly showed that she had great affection for him. And that was kind of enough for the public and the media to kind of decide that was the story. You know, she was the young blonde gold digger. She couldn't be any worse, you know, because look who she'd been having an affair with, you know, and that sort of led to the spiral of events that finally led to, you know, the spoiler alert, which I'm not going to tell you in the book, but that sort of led to lots and lots of other things. But within the book, I tried to find out, you know, the background of the families and other issues that might have come into play with the book and the case, especially if it happened today. How would we see it today?
James, I just want to jump in. So this is a tough time. I'm sorry I've lost my video here, but were any of her relatives still alive?
Yes, there were. It took a while to track them down. The one I really wanted to track down was the son that Cecil and Diane had. They had a young son who was 3 years old when the murder happened. So he was the one I initially found out about first, because unfortunately, he was in the papers a lot. Pictures of him, you know, with his dead father and with his mother. And I tried to track him down, and I did. Firstly, I found his son, because obviously he was a grown man now. He had been married and had a child himself. I found his son first. And his son talked to me, and we talked at length several times. And the son didn't know where his father was. They hadn't been in touch for 20 or 30 years. But the last address he had, for whatever reason, I called it, and the son, Mark, his name was. Diane and Cecil's son was called Mark. And he actually called his own son Mark, just to make it confusing. But I called Mark and he called me back. And he said, yes, he'd always wanted to talk about the case, and it really did affect his life. And he was very keen to talk to me and had been looking into it his whole life and really wanted to be involved in the book, which was great. I thought my job was done. This was very early on in the process. I thought, I didn't have to do any work. I could talk to, Mark wasn't there the night of the murder. He was being with his grandmother who was babysitting for him. Thank goodness he wasn't there. But I thought that was problem solved, book done, and then I got a letter from him a week later, and he said he didn't want to do it. He said it was too upsetting. But in the meantime, over those few weeks, I'd found that Diane actually had 2 other children. She had 2 daughters from her first marriage. And I found both of those. One of them had been a baby when the first marriage had ended. So she really didn't know her mother at all. But the elder daughter, who I've spoken to many, many times now, and I went to visit in Texas. There's a whole chapter on the book where I go to see her in Texas. She had known her mother up till about the age of 5. That was when the marriage had ended. And I talked to her and she said, well, one day my mother took me to school and I never saw her again. And the next thing she heard was, that her mother was, spoiler alert, no longer alive. Although I'm not telling you when that happened. But so so she had few memories of her mother, but she was able to tell me a lot of stuff and show me a lot of pictures and give me some idea of who Diane Wells was, because that's what I tried to find out in the book was who was she? What happened in her life that ended her up, being charged with murder?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we all are fascinated by these situations and incidents that take place, and you get involved in the details of the crime and the investigation. But then when you look at the ripple effect that something like this has, it doesn't just affect the people that are involved, primarily involved. It affects so many other people, and the effect that it has on, in this case, like you said, the children.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this book particularly interesting, because it doesn't, it's not a procedural, strictly a procedural in terms of investigation. It comes at it in a very humanistic approach, in that you really see the fallout from something and how terrible a crime like this is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm glad it came across that way, because I did try to lay the book out. You have to talk about that. There's the official side, the formal side, the investigation of what happened. But I'm coming to it, 60, 70 years later. I'm talking to these people who were children at the time, and they're sitting there going, well, I'm 78 now, and I still don't know what happened to my, grandfather. I still don't know what happened to my dad. Talked about it all his life and always wondered what had happened. So I talked to all those people, and you're absolutely right that the generational trauma of it. There were really only 1 or 2 happy stories that I found within the book of all the people I talked to. Only 1 or 2 people who seemed happy now and had a relatively happy life. All the others that I talked to, it had been something that it wasn't a skeleton in their closet or taboo or anything like that, but it was something that was just never talked about, and they'd always wondered all their lives, and the more I talked to these people who were in their 70s and 80s, they were saying, I never knew anything that happened. Even some of the ancillary characters, the person that was called the third suspect, in relation to the crime, he was a friend of Cecil and Diane. He lived in the same building. He was a ballroom dancing teacher. He taught them, ballroom dancing lessons, and he became a friend of them. And later on, it seemed that he and Diane were very close friends as well. And I talk about that in the book. Now, I tried to track down his family. I managed to find a granddaughter, and she spoke to me and she said, well, my mother's still alive, who would be this third suspect's daughter. She never talks about her father, ever. So I know nothing about him at all, my grandfather. And, she was just one of the cases within the book where I found out things from various members of the Wells family, the Warren family, and this family, William Columbany, his name was, the Columbany family. I found out things that I knew that they didn't know about their family history, just from really looking up, ancestry.com and the newspapers and talking to people, but because it had been something that was really not talked about, and then it was kind of forgotten, because the murder never came to trial. And then in 1959, Alaska became a state, and that really drew a line across everything that had happened before. And it was all kind of forgotten. The murder was, a 6-month sensation in the newspapers, at best. But, I was talking to people who say, I have a teenage daughter now, and she's asking me about my dad. And, I've said, well, I don't know, I haven't seen him for 30 years. And then she asked me about, my grandparents. And I go, well, I believe one of them was murdered and I think the other one might have killed him. But that's all I know. And it was just heartbreaking to
I was just thinking, everybody talks about writers and having distance and objectivity and things like that. You must have felt a tremendous amount of responsibility.
It became more and more so as I was doing it, especially when I went to Texas to talk with Diane's eldest daughter, whose name was Sandra, or is Sandra. She told me a lot of stuff about her family and her life. And there was a time when I was sitting there, and I can't remember whether I put it in the book or not, because I didn't want it to look a little exploitative, but I felt bad. But there was a moment where I just thought to myself, what am I doing here? Getting this lovely, elderly lady to tell me all these awful things that happened in her life. What good is it doing? Am I just poking around in something that's not important? But my wife kept saying this to me all the way through. She said, listen to what these people are saying to you. They want to know. They want to tell you. And the fact that I was a stranger, I was a complete stranger. I wasn't a family member. A lot of books akin to this are often written by family members or someone whose sister was murdered or husband was murdered or was accused of murder. That's very common within the true crime genre, but I had no stakes in it, and I think that made it easier for people to talk to me, because clearly the families never really talked about it much at the time. And why on earth would they have talked about it 50 years later, to bring it up as to what happened?
I see that that would make it easier for people to talk to you. But I get the feeling that as this project progressed, you got closer and closer to the people you were researching, and that you developed, I don't know how you could not develop a relationship of some sort with the victims and the potential criminal people or whoever that are in this, and trying to stay objective. When you hear so much emotional, you get all this emotional input, and you have to sort that out so that your readers, because this is really an interesting book, you have to keep your distance. So how did you do that? How did you stay objective?
Well, the most terrifying bit was when I sent out the copies to the people who I'd interviewed and spoken to, because I from the beginning, I made it very clear that I'm not going to solve this. This isn't a cold case. I didn't expect anyone to confess to me on their deathbed or whatever that they did it, or that they know exactly what happened. Honestly, at the beginning, I thought that as soon as I talked to a couple of family members, they would say, well, it never went to court, but we all know what happened. It was this, and that when that didn't happen, I thought, damn it, are they going to expect me to solve it? Which wasn't possible. There's no evidence. There was no DNA back in the 50s. And whilst it did become a little bit clear throughout what I was doing, probably what had happened, what had happened the night of the murder, I knew when I was talking to these family members, quite understandably, Sandra, who was Diane's eldest daughter, was like, well, obviously she didn't do the murder, and she wasn't involved in this, and she didn't do that, and she didn't do that. And it wasn't my place to sit there and go, you know what? I think it probably was the case. I think that probably was the case. Or even to correct people, from what they thought the story had been, because they'd lived with the story for 50 years and they felt that something had happened one way. And I had seen the files and I knew that it hadn't. And I knew it all had to go in the book. And the terrifying moment was when I sent the books out and I thought, people are going to read this and they're going to read things that they don't want to read. And I'm just going to have to hope that the way I've talked to them and that the way I've dealt with them, they feel that I've been fair and that I'm telling them the facts as the best I can see it, because at least, thank goodness, it's nonfiction. I can't really make anything up. Of course, the last chapter of the book is I do fictionalize what I think happened on the night of the murder. I include all things that were reported and were in the witness statements as to what happened, and I put them in a sort of semi-fictional narrative as to what might have happened, and crucially as to what happened after Cecil was shot. What happened to the murder weapon, what phone calls were made, that kind of thing. And I'll stand by it. I think it's the most probably reasonable and likely scenario for what happened, but I can't possibly know because I wasn't there, but looking back, 70 years later, some of the things that we know today about mental health and mental illness, and also about domestic abuse, how that's seen in society, how we're much more aware of it now as a term and able to recognize it. Whereas in the 50s, domestic abuse wasn't even a term. It was very common, female rights and the rights of women at home. Women were often the homemakers. They didn't have a credit card, they didn't have a bank account, they looked after the children. The men did all of that. It was very much a sort of a kind of a Mad Men era in a way. And if something was going on behind the net curtains of a house, people usually looked the other way and it wasn't their business. But I think today we maybe don't look away as much. And I think today we would look at things differently. And I think that might have helped with some of the conclusions I reached and some of the things that some of the people I interviewed read, and it might have made sense now. But, on the opposite direction, Cecil and his family, I mean, he was married 5 times. He had a number of children, and, he's got, countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren now. And I'm sure they're reading the book and saying, well, how dare you write this down about, this Alaskan pioneer who was murdered in his bedroom? How dare you write this about him? And I'm only going on what I was told.
Well, So I don't mean to cut you off, James.
No,
but,
you're not.
We are running short of time, but I have one question. What is it? I mean, obviously this is a passion project for you. And I think anybody who is interested in true crime, anybody who is interested in mysteries would love this. But when you were writing it, did you think about what you hoped people who were reading the book would think when they finish the book? Because I think that's what we should end on. What do you hope that people who read The Alaskan Blonde feel when they read the last page and close the book?
Like any author, I always just assume that no one's ever going to read it. No one's going to be. My primary thing is the aim is I wanted to maybe a better sense of understanding. I mean, I wasn't looking. I'll go back to where I was because we just stopped recording there for a second. I hope it's interesting. I hope it's entertaining. I hope people learn a little something, because I think certainly that period, 1950s in territorial Alaska, was unlike things we can't really imagine today. It was in a completely different world. As Alaska's a very different place.
So this is a journey. This is an escape book.
It is. I mean,
Adventure,
it takes you back to a very
crime.
different time, and it's sort of, and I think it has parallels with today. This is a story that you could see on, Dateline or 48 Hours or anything like that, where they say, they were happily married. He was the rich, successful businessman. She was the young, blonde trophy wife. Then one night, 2 men broke in and shot him and beat her up. She said it was a burglary, but the police were immediately suspicious when, it emerged she'd been having an affair. That's exactly what happens. It's the case with so many murders and so many crimes, so in that case, it's not unusual. But the fact that it was a story from territorial Alaska in the 50s, when stuff like that really didn't hit the newspapers in the world, really didn't hit the big magazines, and the fact it was so kind of film noir, the fact that she was so like the film
Glamorous,
noir blonde,
right.
and he was the handsome, rich businessman. And just because so much I found, you couldn't have written it. There was so much stuff I found that you couldn't believe that if it was fiction, you'd read it and go, well, you can't put that, because that kind of thing would never happen.
Well, I'm excited for you. I'm excited for us to be able to finally read this project that I know you have been working on for so long, and that so many people, that impacts so many people. So where can people find your book, James? Where can people find The Alaskan Blonde?
Of course, it's on Amazon at the moment. It's starting to make its way into some of the bookstores and stuff around in LA. I'm doing it's sort of a limited release first into the cities that are related to the book. So obviously here, I mean, you probably don't have many people watching today who are in Alaska, but it's obviously available in Alaska because it's still a story that people remember there, certainly of the older generation, because it was a huge story back at the time. And there's various other places around here and a lot of libraries and stuff, but Amazon is the main place.
So also, if you have any places that you're going to be talking about the book, well, if you send them to us, we'll get them.
Yeah, it's probably going to be stuff like that is going to happen a little later in the year, because I wanted initially the book to come out and the anniversary of the murder, but it got a good response at Left Coast Crime, and people seem to have been really nice about it. So it sort of sneaked out on its own, and I had to sort of go with it.
It escaped on its own.
It kind of escaped. Like I say, it's like most of it. I never thought anyone would be interested and would want to read it, but people did seem interested. So I just thought, well, I'm going to have to get this out there now while people are interested.
Well, it sounds like the book has taken on a life of its own, which bodes well for its success. So. And yes. Your success. We wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
In the book, we thank you. We thank you for being here and for being patient with our technical difficulties this morning.
No problem.
But that doesn't impact how important this book is and how sincerely we hope that it does well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
We will put the link in the video. We thank you for being here. We thank you all for being here. If you're interested in more videos like this, you can go to SCWA Writers Online, our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in this video, also in its edited form, you can find it on YouTube. And please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends.
And I'll answer any questions. If anyone puts any questions underneath the video, I'll answer them, because there's so much stuff I couldn't put in the book.
Okay, perfect. So if you have questions, James is going to be checking both Facebook and YouTube. So feel free to comment and ask questions. Thanks for bringing that up again, James, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.